All right, we talked about carbon dioxide decreasing. Now let's talk about the oxygen eventually increasing in the atmosphere. Let's first take a step back and let's talk about those cyanobacteria and stromatolites, shall we? Cyanobacteria were present back in the Archean. Those are the little photosynthetic bacteria. Stromatolites are the structures that they form. The actual living organisms are the cyanobacteria. Even though they existed in the Archean, they didn't become common until about 2.3 billion years ago, so into the Paleoproterozoic. It's really these organisms, at least from the evidence that we know now, that were essential in adding free oxygen to the evolving atmosphere. Photochemical dissociation, which I talked about last unit, somewhat to play, but it's more so these cyanobacteria more so responsible for adding oxygen to the atmosphere, although not right away. The oxygen they produced didn't necessarily go right away into the atmosphere. It was actually utilized elsewhere before. In fact, with these cyanobacteria forming stromatolites, these are in the oceans, right? So they're photosynthetic, so when they give off oxygen, right, it first kind of percolates in the ocean. Well, that free oxygen that was rattling around the ocean kind of stayed there for a while. It was actually being utilized by something else to create these structures called banded iron formations, BIFs. Remember we talked about these last unit? Again, a little refresher. So banded iron formations are kind of layers of iron-rich mineral and chert or jasper, which is actually silicate-based minerals, kind of like quartz. Again, these BIFs form on the sea floor. Again, we talked about some BIFs were found in Archean rocks, but not a whole heck of a lot. They started to form in the Archean, but 92% of all BIFs formed during the interval from about 2.5 to 2 billion years ago. And then they didn't form after that. So banded iron formations really came to prominence and stopped in the Proterozoic eon. The iron that is in these banded formations probably came from a couple of places. The weathering of rocks on land, so think back to the carbonate and silicate cycle, amongst other things. But also those submarine hydrothermal vents, similar to what we see today, those black smokers that we talked about. So what do these BIFs in the atmosphere have in common? So the Archean atmosphere was deficient in free oxygen. There was no oxygen in the atmosphere in the Archean. So seawater probably did not have much dissolved oxygen either. So if oxygen is absent, all right, in the oceans, iron easily kind of accumulates and builds up. It doesn't attach to too many things. It really likes oxygen. Iron really loves to attach to oxygen. But if there was no oxygen, neither in the atmosphere or in the waters really, it just kind of builds up and builds up. So we have all this iron kind of mineral, just elemental iron kind of floating around, these ions of iron kind of just floating around in water. And that's what happened during the Archean. But again, as these cyanobacteria first evolved and kind of flourished, they started to release oxygen as a byproduct. Remember, in photosynthesis, cyanobacteria are photosynthesizing bacteria, like plants are. They use carbon dioxide, which there's plenty of, and that helped to bring some of the CO2 out of the atmosphere and oceans as well. So you have CO2 plus water plus sunlight, and that makes sugar, the food for a plant, and then the waste product is oxygen. Plants give out oxygen, or photosynthesizing bacteria in this case give off oxygen. So as cyanobacteria came to prominence, they're giving off oxygen that's going into the ocean. And again, there's all this iron ions floating around. And iron, like I said, really likes to combine with oxygen to form rust-like iron oxide minerals. So all of a sudden, these stromatolites structures with all these cyanobacteria giving out oxygen, and the iron's like, wait a minute, yeah, let me get some of that. So really no oxygen was able to get into the atmosphere because there was so much iron in the ocean. It just grabbed onto that oxygen before it could percolate out to the atmosphere. And so you get these rust-like iron oxide minerals, kind of layering with silica, the chert and jasper, and thus created these banded iron formations. Remember, the iron oxide minerals that are created when iron grabs onto this oxygen are things like hematite. You get 2 iron atoms, iron's Fe, combining with 3 oxygen atoms, or magnetite, 3 iron atoms combined with 4 oxygen atoms. So how did this work? So again, there's all this iron floating around, right? There's all this iron floating around, whether it's from weathered material from the continents or these black smokers giving off this mineral-rich hot water. Remember, what black smokers do as the water soaks into the ground, is heated up by the magma chamber or mantle below. That hot water helps to dissolve some of the rocks and the minerals and ions in there. So when that hot mineral-rich water comes pumping out of there, there's a bunch of stuff. Iron just happens to be in that. So there's a lot of iron floating around the oceans because of these black smokers and just from weathering and erosion of the land, different minerals, different rocks. So we have all this iron. It's got nothing to do, just floating around. All of a sudden, stromatolites evolve, start giving out oxygen as a waste product of photosynthesis. Again, this iron's like, hey, let me get some of that. So then these things start to combine. And as they combine, once they combine to an iron oxide mineral, it immediately precipitates out and falls down to kind of the ocean floor. All right. I don't know if it's on a later slide, but I'll mention it right away. So then when this happens, all right, once, because these things are continuing to give out oxygen, when this happens, maybe all the iron in the area might not necessarily all be used up, but a good portion of it might be used up. Remember, back from the carbonate silicate cycle, we also have silica floating around here. So when the silica combine with the oxygen to make SiO2, that's what the chert or jasper is made out of. So again, maybe we have used up all the iron, and then now we're going to layer it with that silicate oxide, that chert, and then that might allow, then all of a sudden we might get more iron, and then now we get another iron oxide layer, and then once all that iron's used up, then the oxygen combines with the silicate, blah, 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 blah. And that continues to happen, and continues to happen, and continues to happen, until all, or most of the iron in the ocean is finally all used up. But these stromatolites are still giving off oxygen. It's not until the ocean is pretty much clear of iron in its water. There's really not much iron left in the ocean just floating around in there. Once that happened, then this oxygen can finally make its way to the atmosphere and increase in oxygen. So even though these stromatolites have been around for a long time producing oxygen, most of that stayed in the ocean. Iron was stealing it. And then after most of the iron precipitated out as an iron oxide minerals in these banded iron formations, then the oxygen was like, hey, we can go up. No one's taking us. Let's go to the atmosphere. There you go. So remember some images of banded iron formations. The darker material is the iron-rich minerals, usually hematite or magnetite. The red is the chert or jasper. So again, just some different images that you see here. Yeah, sometimes sparkly. Again, banding comes from once the free iron in the location is used up, then that silica deposit, chert or jasper, is deposited until the iron builds up again, then it goes back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Again, once most of the iron is oxidized in the ocean, again, finally that oxygen can now go up into the atmosphere. Thank you, stromatolites. So, if you would like to see some additional videos on banded iron formation and the processes, just like the previous video, here's a couple of videos. I'll link those in the YouTube description. Make sure you're watching these videos in YouTube so you can access this. If not, if you download the PowerPoint, you can always click on those links to go to these as well. So in any case, banded iron formations, great evidence of now oxygen being produced, and once banded iron formations are no longer being produced because all the iron's used up, then we see this increase in oxygen. And in fact, let me go back here. Let me switch this up here. So again, banded iron formations end about, they extend from about 2.5 billion years ago to about 2 billion years ago. and then you can see oxygen finally shows up and starts to increase. So our last banded iron formations are about 2 billion years old, and now that oxygen can finally, this is oxygen in the atmosphere, can finally start to grow. So it's slow going during the Proterozoic. It really ramps up in the next eon, but it's kind of slow going, but it's right here. Finally, all the iron's used up, banded iron formations are no longer being created, now that oxygen can go into the atmosphere. All right. All right, let's talk about continental red beds as well. So this is an indication now that oxygen is increasing in the atmosphere. So what this refers to is the red sandstone or red colored shales that we see that are colored by iron oxides, especially hematite. And these first begin in the geologic record about 1.8 billion years ago. That's when I just showed you on that chart that oxygen finally started to jump up in the atmosphere and increase. Again, and that increased throughout the Proterozoic. The onset and creation of these red beds coincides with the introduction of free oxygen into the atmosphere. And that's because these sedimentary rocks, sandstone and shale, these detrital sedimentary rocks, are usually, these red ones, are indication of terrestrial environments. Sediment that was deposited on land, or maybe rivers and lakes, not oceanic in this case. Not oceanic in this case. That's why the red sedimentary layers, red sandstones, everyone loves to see them because they're not too often. Sandstone, most sedimentary rocks, as mentioned, indicate some transitional, shallow marine to deep marine environment. But it's the red sandstones and the red shales that what we see around Sedona and a number of the other places around the world that people are just kind of drawn to. And these indicate a terrestrial environment, not the marine environment. The reason being is because the sediment itself, say for instance the sand, which might have some iron content to it, reacts with now the oxygen in the atmosphere. So instead of iron reacting with oxygen in the oceans to form banded iron formations, we have iron ions in the sand reacting with oxygen in the air to create iron oxides, which on land, hematite, when it oxidized like rust on a car, if you know what that is, kind of turns that orangish reddish color. Same thing here. So this hematite now in the land, terrestrial environment, as the iron reacts with the oxygen in the atmosphere, becomes kind of rust, essentially. This hematite, this red rust, iron oxide. So, kind of what we see around Sedona, again, so these indicate more terrestrial deposition of sediment. You can actually see in the background how it changes from orange reddish rocks, these red beds, kind of more of a yellow sandstone, so, or maybe even a limestone. So that's more indicative now of a marine depositional environment. But these red ones is more land-based, more terrestrial-based. Again, we're looking at this kind of reddish stuff versus more so the yellowish. You remember this one? Do you remember this one? Do you remember this? We're talking about unconformities. This is Sicker Point. We see some red beds here as well. So some sort of terrestrial depositional environment. And all of this is indicating now around, again, 1.8 billion years ago, we start to see these. So that can only occur once oxygen is now in the atmosphere, because that oxygen is interacting with the iron on land to form this rusted color iron oxide hematite. All right, and here are some more. So these come later. These don't show up again until about 1.8 billion years ago, which now indicates oxygen is into the atmosphere. So we have the rocks to tell that story. So the geosphere connected to the atmosphere, connected to the hydrosphere. So let's go ahead and pause here. Remember, there's those additional videos on banded iron formations, how they formed, kind of in the YouTube description below. Make sure you're watching these videos on YouTube. So we'll take a pause here. I think when we come back, we'll have two more sections, probably two more videos. One on life in the Proterozoic is what we'll be talking about next. I'll see you back here in just a second.